Hi everyone, welcome to another Player Development Project Q&A. Pleased to be joined once again by PDP Technical Advisor Dan Wright. Dan, how are you, mate?
Good, thank you. How are you? Where are you this week? You look like you're in a prison.
You're very. I'll let the hotel staff know that you like the place. I'm actually here in New Zealand this week. I've flown over from Melbourne and doing a bit of coaching here this week. So really looking forward to getting out on the grass in the next 3 days, and hopefully the rain out there stops. So yeah, it should be a good week, mate. And we've got an interesting question for this one. What books do you recommend for coaches to read? And that's come in via Twitter from Pete. So really interesting one, and we've done a little bit of preparation around this because obviously there's plenty of books out there that we'd recommend. Dan, do you want to kick us off and share your first recommended book?
Yeah, okay. So the first one on my list was The Philosophy of Football in the Shadows of Marcelo Bielsa by Jed Davis.
Okay.
So Jed's a guy that works over in Canada with Ottawa Fury. And the book is all around Bielsa and his coaching and his influence on other coaches. So this is someone that's influenced Guardiola and Pochettino and Sampioli. And the book is it's mostly in possession, but it's quite a tactical book. It's got 50 training sessions, and it talks a lot about the movements and rotations that Bielsa enjoys and sort of tries to put on his teams, who's very influential on sort of how Chile plays football. And then, some of the formations and some of the systems of play he tries to use in his matches. So this is a coach that's influenced lots of other coaches, and a really sort of in detail book from Jed. That one, I'd recommend that as a tactical read. That'd be number one on my list.
Okay, brilliant. Sounds good. Well, look, number one from my perspective is legacy. Obviously, I've rambled about it in plenty of these discussions as to a great example of how sport really ties into culture. So this book ties into what the All Blacks do. It speaks to past legends about how the culture around the team is being formed, how it's very much owned by the players. It's got great insights from many of the men that have been involved in coaching the team, and a lot of content there from Gilbert Anoka, who's a renowned sports psychologist who's been involved with the team for a long time. And it's a really good example of how that culture actually translates from what the team's about to the results on the pitch, and what is arguably one of the most successful sports teams of all time. So recommend that one.
Yeah, that had to be number one on your list, really, didn't
It
it?
did, mate. It's a cracking book. What about you? What's next up?
My second one, I've got Quiet Leadership by Carlo Ancelotti. So, Carlo Ancelotti, obviously one of the best managers ever in terms of success winning the Champions League as a player and a coach. And this one sort of goes through his managerial journey, from Parma to Juventus to AC Milan, Paris Saint-Germain, Real Madrid and Chelsea. And what's interesting about this book is he talks about each job sort of having a lifespan. So how he influences the people around him and how long that span might be. So he talks about sometimes he knew that lifespan was going to be quite quick, and then perhaps the job that he had at Paris Saint-Germain, that lifespan was slightly different because he had to influence the sporting directors and all the logistics team to make PSG a world force and a Champions League sort of side. But also interestingly in the book, it's got a lot of sort of added bits from players. So there's a bit from Beckham, there's a bit from Zlatan, and they talk about how Ancelotti actually led the teams and perhaps his softer way of working with individuals and connecting with people, not just footballers. And he also, there's a bit in there where he talks about how he learns from all the players he meets. So he learns the cultures, he learns the languages, he learns different sort of approaches to training. And I suppose someone that's travelled all over these countries and all over these roles, that's made him sort of who the manager he is. So it's not even strictly a football book. I suppose it's more of a leadership book. So it could be a good one to read in terms of business as well. But yeah, that was number two on my list.
Definitely. I mean, Ancelotti's got such an aura about him, doesn't he? Real calm confidence. So sounds like a good read. Next one for me would be Start With Why by Simon Sinek, another guy that we've cited in different conversations over time. Great book in terms of understanding leadership. So the book really focuses on how a lot of leaders talk about what they do, and it is a sort of more commercial focused book, and it cites companies like Apple and why they're successful. And the reason generally is because they understand their why and their purpose, and that then gets, I guess, adopted or really bought into by the people involved in the company. So it's important that we start with why, and he sort of taps into a lot of emotional intelligence, and he is probably one of the most influential sociocultural sort of anthropologists at the moment. And if you don't want to read the book, there is also a couple of great TED Talks, which are a good little cheat there. But so many people would have seen some of the viral videos that have gone out recently around millennials and understanding people. Highly recommend Start With Why for coaches, because it's great to understand and help develop your own environment.
Yeah, it's not one that I've read, that one. I have seen the TED Talks, and he talks about, the big companies sort of starting with why, and, why people buy Apple products, because they tap into that. The third one on my list is Pep Confidential. Quite an obvious choice, I think, and this was also followed up with the Evolution, but I thought Pep Confidential was actually better. So this one is the first season of Guardiola's management of Bayern Munich. So the book touches on lots of things, but mainly sort of the differences in culture from what Pep probably understood at Barcelona and then going into Bayern Munich in terms of training methods, but also working with the players. And the writer does a good job of sort of breaking down Pep's thought processes and approaches to tactics in the big games. It talks about, how players get injured and how he adapts the shapes, and also sort of dealing with the counter-attack sort of mentality in Germany, but really sort of behind the scenes, and a really good sort of insight to how Pep thinks and how he approaches the biggest games.
Sounds very good. Sounds good. Well, next one for me is Ryan Holiday's book, Ego is the Enemy. Ryan Holiday was a very successful person in business, particularly in marketing, and sort of reached a point in his life where a few things came crashing down around him, and he sort of had a few realizations. And the book taps into the idea around ego being an unhealthy belief in our own importance, ego undermining us on a learning journey. And ego is something that can be managed and directed, and making sure that we're putting our energy in the right ways. And obviously I've written about this before in my article, Get Over Yourself, and the importance of staying humble as a coach and embracing the learning journey. I think it's really important to read this book because it's got some real key ideas. To give you a couple of examples, it talks about maintaining your own scorecard and kind of keeping yourself in check, as well as ideas like don't fake it till you make it, just go out there and actually make it. So there's obviously a lot of pretenders in any industry, and it's important. It talks about authenticity and just staying humble in your journey as you learn. So messages like always being a student are quite prevalent in this book. So another one worth checking out.
Yeah. How do you find the balance between sort of football books and books that can sort of help you as an individual and help you as a coach? Would you say that you've got sort of 50-50 balance of that, or do you just pick things up that you find interesting? How do you sort of select what you're going to read?
Yeah, look, I've always been a massive fan of sports autobiographies across the board. So, always reading sports books as a kid and always reading them as a coach. And I think as time's gone on, I've sort of looked further afield, and I am a believer in looking outside of just football for your content, and making sure that you're putting yourself outside the comfort zone a little bit, and things like productivity and just people I find quite fascinating. So I think it's important just to look outside the code.
Yeah. Well, in terms of sort of comfort zone, this next book is the one I'm reading at the moment, which is definitely out of my comfort zone. So the title is Nonlinear Pedagogy in Skill Acquisition and Introduction. So this one's quite a heavy read, quite academic. I struggled to read sort of more than 30 minutes ago, but definitely some really good takeaway messages for coaches working, at all levels. It isn't just for elite coaches. And basically this book sort of discusses the complex relationship between the learner and the environment, and how the coach can design a more realistic and relevant practice that will help the players make decisions in the game. So lots of things we talk about and lots of things that we preach through the PDP. And this was, a book that was recommended to me, and I would sort of recommend it to other people, but not something you'd read probably for enjoyment and excitement. It was more basically, to get an understanding of that sort of non-linear journey for the player.
Fantastic. Well, next on my list is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. Obviously, sort of got a reputation as a bit of a godfather in modern psychology, the late, great Stephen Covey. And the book, just to give a quick summary, talks about the 7 habits of being an effective person. 1, being proactive. 2, beginning with the end in mind. 3, putting first things first. 4, thinking win-win. 5, seek to understand, then to be understood. 6, synergize. And 7, sharpen the saw. So some really good ideas and principles about how to be effective in what you do. And from a leadership perspective, I don't think there's too many better than Stephen Covey.
No, that's an all-time classic, isn't it, that one? Next on my list is a book by Matthew Syed. So this is Black Box Thinking. So basically this talks about, how businesses and organizations can learn from their mistakes. So it sort of discusses a few different industries and a few different organizations, and some that do reflect hence the title Black Box Thinking. So it's talking about pilots and how they've made the air industry really safe by reflecting on some of their practices, and it talks about accidents and events that have happened and how they've sort of addressed those problems. So now it's become more and more safe. The main sort of two things that I took away from this book were unconscious bias, which I think is happens a lot in coaching. So thinking we're going to see something and then it happens, basically. And then with that was the cognitive dissonance. So having an opinion on the world or seeing the world in a certain light, and then the world sort of you reshaping that world to make sure you saw what you saw. So those were sort of the two main things that I took away from that book. But a really sort of popular one with coaches at the moment, and definitely one I'd recommend.
Yeah, certainly ties into values-based coaching, doesn't it? And that sort of idea. Next, Creature of Habit, myself, Stephen Covey's follow-up to The 7 Habits, The 8th Habit, aptly named. A really sort of really effective book in terms of drilling down on leadership. So talking about principle-centered leadership, finding your own voice, and then helping others find theirs. So from a coaching perspective, this is a book that resonated massively with me in terms of developing people and developing players. Talks about focusing on what's important and focusing on a few crucial goals, and making sure that you translate those goals into specific actions and how you're actually going about achieving things. So again, from a leadership perspective, a fantastic read.
Good stuff. Next on my list, I've got No Hunger in Paradise by Michael Calvin. So this one's sort of behind the scenes in academy football, isn't it? A book that sort of created a little bit of a stir in terms of youth football and academy football. So it talks about some of the challenges that players and parents and coaches face. And there are a few sort of good messages in there as well, but a lot of probably sort of the risks and dangers of players making it, and people being perhaps sold that dream that everyone's going to make it under eights, and some of the pitfalls, I suppose, upon that journey. Is that one that you've read?
Yeah, it is, and it's one that I enjoyed. I think it polarized opinion in academy coaching circles, and for good reason. There was some good and some not so good in there, but I think there was some great sort of stories around some of the players that have had success in the environments they've come from. When hearing about stories of resilience, but I also think it's important that books like this do emerge to keep industry standards in check as well, and to keep people honest and make sure that we're all working towards the players' interests. And whilst it was controversial, I did think there were some good messages in there for coaches and some good stories to look at in terms of success. So next up for me would be Carol Dweck's Mindset. Really good understanding of the idea of growth mindset. Obviously, it's become a bit of a sort of pop culture phenomenon in the world of coaching, and personally, I think that parents should be reading this one as well. I mean, in terms of just having kids around and the way we speak, the way we communicate, praise versus affirmation, which is a sort of idea that we've covered through PDP as well, and just the language that we use with young people, and I guess the dangers of praise at times as well. So really interesting read, one that I'm sure many coaches have read, but if you haven't, worth checking out.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant, that one. And the next one on my list is Leading, the Sir Alex Ferguson book. So this one links into the recent masterclass we did with Paul McGuinness, and just the whole sort of culture at Manchester United. So when we think about Alex Ferguson, and these things are in the book as well, discipline, control, teamwork, motivation. So it's how Alex Ferguson sort of built a team from scratch, and how they became such a dominant team that sort of reshaped themselves. But he also sort of talks about things that probably go under the radar a little bit in terms of delegation and dealing with failure. So it sort of links into that black box thinking. But yeah, a book that's definitely should be on everyone's list. Yeah,
it's a quality read, that one. Next for me is The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle. Been around a little while. It really sort of cracks open the myth of talent, and it's obviously a word that can be controversial at times and misconstrued at different times, but talks about it from a neurological standpoint, in terms of how our brain works, and a little bit of neuroscience there, but as well as talking about the ideas of deep practice and trying to chunk practice into small units and such. So it's obviously a topic that's been written about by a few people. But I think from the biggest thing that I took out of this one was just the understanding of how the brain works, and some of the case studies that he sort of showcased from different areas, whether it was the arts, music, or sport. Again, a really interesting read for coaches, and one I'd recommend.
Yeah, I thought that book was quite a good one of sort of balancing the science with real life case studies. So although it's quite a heavy topic, it didn't feel like a hard read. That one was quite good. I've got a similar sort of vibe for my next book. So my next book is Bounce. This is one of the first sort of non-football books I ever read. I think we've got a link on the PDP website that's worth sort of diving into. But basically, this similar to what you've just said. This one talks about what is talent, deliberate practice, and how important is practice. So there's a great story in there about one small street in Reading that's produced more table tennis players than the rest of the country put together. Is that luck? Is it talent? Is it the environment? And basically, there was a small sort of shed or practice area that the members of this club could go to and practice throughout the day. So it was 24/7. Everyone had a key. And so there's a really good sort of link between the environment and the individuals and that sort of maybe that talent hotspot that they produced. But yeah, a really good book that's not just about football. It's loads of different sports. And again, links in some of the science about how people learn and how people develop. So yeah, that was one of the first ones I ever read. Have you read that one?
Yeah, I have read that one. I really enjoyed it. A good book, and definitely worth checking out. Next on my list is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a, and just to keep our iTunes rating, I won't finish that sentence, but a great book by a guy called Mark Manson, who's in his mid-30s, and sort of really strikes on the idea of values. So he talks about finding something important and meaningful in your life, and productivity again, what's worth spending your time and energy on. And from a coaching perspective, you're talking about people that are often doing things because they love it. And I think this really struck a chord with me around that, and I guess how you want to allocate your time and energy and how values influence the decisions you make. So definitely worth checking out. And I've seen it, going through the airport recently, it's still on the top 10 shelves everywhere. So highly recommend that for coaches. And I just want to go on to the next one because they sort of tie up a little bit. The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf DeBelly. Similarly to a couple of the books you referred to earlier, this one is sort of anecdotal, short, sharp chapters talking about psychology and ideas like survivorship bias, confirmation bias, social proof, authority bias, and all the things that affect our decision making. So definitely recommend people check that one out in terms of understanding how decision making works.
Brilliant. You broke the format there of our system. I don't know if I'm going to be able to continue. Yeah. So yeah, the number 9 on my list. I might do number 10 as well, just to stick with you. It's like the new ABBA penalties. Number 9 on my list is Inverting the Pyramid by Jonathan Wilson. So this book is all about the history and evolution of tactics. So basically, how did football start all the way through to sort of the modern era. Really, really interesting. And anybody who's interested in sort of tactics and shapes and why players are called certain positions, why is a centre-back called a centre-back? How did we evolve from playing with 2 to 3 to 4 to some teams playing with 5, and the WM formation? It's a really, really interesting book. Again, quite heavy, and there's a lot of the sort of the culture and the social side going into the sports and how the maybe the pressures from outside affected the manager's choices. But a really, really interesting book, and the chapter on Sacchi and AC Milan is definitely worth a read. That's something I actually have on my iPad, and I tend to try and read sort of once a month, not the whole book. I'm not that good, but try and read a little bit all the time, because there's things you see on Match of the Day and Monday Night Football, and some of the things that are sold as new ideas. I think you go back and some of these ideas they were doing in the 1940s. So it's always interesting to see what is a new idea and what's just sort of an adaptation of an idea from the past. But definitely, if you're into your tactics and your shapes and formations, I'd recommend that. And then number 10 on my list, I've got Athlete-Centered Coaching, Developing Decision Makers. So this is a great book from Lynn Kidman. So this book talks about putting the athlete or probably the child at the center of all your decisions and practices. So this one, again, not really about football. There's loads of different contributors from loads of different sports, but lots of practical examples. And it kind of links the research to practice. So it talks about, sort of what the science says and then what that looks in real life. And a lot of the messages that we talk about on a weekly basis are in that book. So if you're interested in child-centered coaching, or you want to put, your individual at the real heart of your practice, that would be a book to start with. What's next on your list, mate?
Yeah, well, lucky last on my list, mate, is a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink. And it's a book I read a little while ago, but it essentially taps into decision making and how pressure affects decision making. So he uses case studies like police who are under enormous amount of pressure in dangerous situations and how their decision making is altered when that kind of pressure is on. And I know this is a topic that's being studied in research around sport as well. So definitely recommend people go and check that one out. So that takes us to number 20 on the list. Any final thoughts from you, mate?
Yeah, I mean, this was obviously quite an interesting exercise from our point of view to sort of come up with 10 each, but I'm sure we've missed some off the list. So, if people have got a favorite sort of coaching book or football book or leadership book or, anything that can sort of help coaching and they think we've missed it off the list, if they want to get in touch through the Facebook or through the Twitter at PlayerDP, I'd be really interested to sort of hear what you think of our list, and perhaps if we've missed your favorite off, get in touch.
Definitely. And obviously we've been through a lot of books, but highly recommend that those who haven't joined up, jump on the website. We've got an enormous library of content, hundreds and hundreds of articles, dozens and dozens of videos where you can get in there and really enhance your learning as a coach. So obviously got to give the site a little shout out. Dan, thanks again for your time. Hopefully we've helped Pete with that list, and we'll look forward to another PDP Q&A very soon.